So I'm taking a break to come and do this presentation with you. Thank you for joining us, and we're going to look at developing a well-being culture. I'll do a little bit of introduction of myself and Julian in a few slides on. And again, feel free to ask questions as we go. Julian will keep an eye on it as we move along into the presentation. And I hopefully will get time to respond to some, maybe even all questions if there are various questions. And again, ask questions in the chat function. So let's get going. So just a quick highlight stat. We're at a 34% engagement level now. This is US stats. So in the second half of 2021, Gallup reported that employee engagement rates in the US had dropped to a dismal 34%. The ratio of engaged to actively disengaged workers in the US is 2.1 to 1, down from 2.6 to 1 in 2020. So we're seeing this across the board with all our clients as well, that there's this downward trend in engagement, mental health. There's various issues happening in the workplace. And also, if you're listening to this, you may feel familiar with this sense of overwhelm. The level of workload people are facing at the moment is just extraordinary. And so it's exacerbating existing issues in the workplace, existing issues around mental health and mental well-being. Just a quick introduction of myself for those of you who don't know me. This is my 22nd year in this field. I have various business degrees and psychotherapy training and so forth. And I'm absolutely obsessed with understanding human behavior. My whole adult life, I've been obsessed with it. And then also I'm passionate about the connection between leadership, culture, performance, and mental health. We see in many of our clients or potential clients where they separate out your mental health strategy from your culture strategy, from your leadership strategy. And we've done a lot of research work to prove that they're actually all interconnected. You'll see several books there in the graphic on the slide. The first book I wrote was with Jim Kouzes and Barry Posner. They happen to have the world's most researched leadership model. It's the most independently validated leadership theory on earth. So our work has this long pedigree of research, evidence-based, what really does actually make a difference. We're not just a consultant, spruiking ideas that we don't really have founded in solid research. The Mindful Leader in the middle book was published in 2016. That's become a multiple bestseller, and that is an extension of Kouzes and Posner's work, and it deepens the understanding of what the modern leadership requirements, and includes additional practices like accountability and the whole self-awareness practice. The book on the bottom left, Vertical Growth, is actually not yet out. We submitted it to the publishers only 2 or 3 weeks ago, and it's in its final editing stages. I put it in there because I'll be referencing some elements of the book in this presentation. We have a mobile app as well that houses various aspects of mental health, well-being, leadership, and so forth. Okay, so what do we do as a business? For those of you, again, don't know, so you've got some context. We're obviously absolutely obsessed and passionate about leadership, culture, mental health, and we support our clients from anything from keynotes right through to 3 to 5 year culture change programs. We've got a model that we use called Inform, Assess, Transform, and Scale. So we have this today is one of the inform processes. So many of our clients just want to inform their employees about whatever the subject is, whether it be, again, leadership or mental health and so forth. We often also do extensive assessments. So when we inform, usually, and clients want to do something with the inform, because of course we all know inform doesn't change anything, it just creates awareness. And then we then start with a base of, okay, but what's the current reality in your organization? And then we set and establish goals around whether that be culture change or, again, mental health goals and so forth. And then we do the transformational work itself, which is a combination of training programs, part digital, coaching, consulting, and so forth. And then lastly, scale. We've got a bunch of digital solutions that allow large global clients. We work with various large global clients who can scale our processes, programs, and take ownership for them as well internally. The company we keep, again, we help you empower your employees to co-create a culture they love working with. And again, we work, as I mentioned, we work with various global organizations. We also work with smaller organizations. Some of those we have a love and joy working with. Here's what we're going to cover today. So we're going to look at the link between leadership culture and mental well-being and show you some interesting stuff around that. We're going to look at why image management's making things a lot worse. For some of you, you may have attended some of our previous webinars. We've talked about image management. We are going to repeat and cover that content again today. This is an extremely significant issue, an interesting issue in the workplace today. And then lastly, we're going to look at the 3 key elements needed for developing a well-being culture. We'll come in a second to what is a well-being culture anyway. But if you're sitting on this webinar and you've clicked in and you've joined the webinar, there's a good chance that some part of you is interested in how do I help my organization develop into a place that creates a net well-being for people. It doesn't diminish well-being and then people leave and I get all these various other challenges with that. Get my slide moving. Come on, slide. So let's begin with the definition. What is a well-being culture? And this is our definition. So it's an organizational and/or team. It doesn't have to be organizational-wide. It can be just a team. It's an organizational and/or team culture that by its very nature supports net mental well-being in people. A culture that provides psychological safety, meaningful connection, a space for growth, empowerment, connection, purpose, and trust. So it's a healthy second home. So we've held this vision for a long time that, organizations, whether they be governmental or they're in business, they've got a mission to achieve. They've got stuff to do. They've got to deliver services and deliver products. And then often mental well-being is sort of dropped in as an afterthought into that. And the engine of the organization is kind of creating toxicity or challenge for people. And then you can drop in a mental well-being strategy, but it really doesn't make much difference at all. And so we've come to realize that what we need is the engine, the culture, the way things are done in the business needs to be generating a feelings of connectedness, well-being, and so forth, so that each employee in that organization feels that their life is improved, is supported, their well-being is better for working in the everyday of that organization than if they weren't. That's the dream we hold for all our clients, and actually for anyone who's not even our client. We would hope that they can find a way to create an organization that by its very nature and the way it operates is a net well-being factor in a person's life that works there. We've got a quick gift for you. If you've managed to stay in the presentation for 10 minutes, congrats, thank you. And our quick gift to you is if you're interested in, we're going to talk a bit about this in the presentation, this idea of the way we support organizations to learn and grow to become a well-being culture. Often we misdiagnose things, and you'll see a little bit later where I talk about webinars. Like a lot of clients will think a webinar or an app will create change or create the necessary change. It turns out that's not true. And a lot of times that's because people are not educated, and we've got a download for you that will give you a chance to read some of the important things around when I'm thinking about how the process of creating a better culture or a better organization, how can I think about that in a more constructive developmental way? And am I diagnosing my issue, or am I addressing things the correct way? And then also within that scan, the QR scan there that you scan on your phone, there'll also be a part that's suggesting or requesting that you might make an appointment with Julian, who I'll introduce more properly in a minute, to actually chat through your strategy to even help you on what you're reading. Okay, so
just adding that I also put the link in the chat.
Okay, so Julian's put a link in the chat. And it's reminding me, let me just introduce Julian. Julian's my co-founder of this business, and I'm more responsible for content itself, this content, and Julian is responsible for the running of the organization, but also critically in strategic consultation with organizations around how they lay out their strategies and how they actually support themselves to become exceptional. And Julian will talk a little bit about a slide, one of the slides later in the presentation. So let's get to point 1, the link between leadership, culture, and mental well-being. So we're going to start off with a little Zoom poll. Hopefully this is more interactive for you. Which of these two, Julian is going to pop up the Zoom poll for you now. Here's the question. Which of these 2 mental well-being strategies is your organization more focused on at the moment? Is it resources, portals, apps, webinars on mental well-being? Or is your organization more concerned from a perspective of well-being on developing a more values-aligned, high-trust, psychological, safe culture? So please, it's anonymous. So please answer as honestly as you can so you can get a sense of what other organizations, because there's many organizations on this webinar, but we're curious to know what's the current reality, how are organizations thinking about well-being in a workplace and well-being strategies in the workplace. Now, Julian, I assume...
So we have 190 answers so far, and it looks like it's 43%, sorry, for resources, portals, apps, webinars, and so on. 57% for developing a more value-aligned cycle.
Okay. Fantastic. All right. So that's really useful information and really healthy to know that if we had done this poll a year ago, we would have found it was probably more like 90% or 95% A, resources, portals, apps, and webinars on mental well-being. And what we are seeing over and over and over again is that organizations are beginning to understand that this just simply does not deliver on well-being. We've had some distress or various distress calls from clients saying to us, like, we keep giving resources, apps, etc., and it's not really working. And I remember one of the most interesting conversations we had was an organization, the whole organizational development team contacted us and asked us our view on how to actually make mental well-being happen. And we just asked them a really simple question. We asked, are you personally using all the resources that you're giving your employees? And there was the stunned silence, and they all admitted, no, we're not even using the resources we're giving our employees. A second poll worth considering, and we're just curious about the results, is which one gets HR or OD the most credit for supporting well-being? So if you're an HR and OD leader and your CEO or your executive team says, we need to look after employee well-being, and you say, okay, well, let's develop a more values-aligned, high-trust, psychologically safe culture, because that'll help, as against, okay, well, great, she has a whole collection of resources, apps, webinars. Which one do you think, or in your experience, gets HR the most credit for supporting mental well-being specifically?
So it looks like it's the exact opposite. 58% for resources, portal, apps, 59 now, and 41 for the second one.
Right. Yeah, right. And so we reason why we wanted to run, thanks, Julian, the reason why we wanted to run this, just to give you a highlight of this, is for those of you who are in an HR or OD function, you're not alone. We see this over and over again, that there's a struggle for the HR division or department to push back the responsibility of well-being onto the executive team or onto the main business, because a lot of the time what the business just wants is, can you just, like, people are like struggling, can you just, like, can I get you a set and forget solution where it just makes, it makes things better, and I'm not necessarily want to take responsibility. And when HR often pushes back on the organization and says, it turns out actually that you are responsible, the leaders are responsible, the behavior in the business, the culture itself is what's creating well-being or non-well-being, often we find our clients or new clients, potential clients, the leaders don't really want to hear that, because that's a lot more responsibility. It's also a more complex question to deal with. And here's the thing. This is what we maintain, right? And again, I'm very happy to hear some chat function views on this, which is, like organizations are not responsible for the diet, exercise, sleep, etc. of their employees, so too they are not responsible for the mental well-being of their employees. A controversial statement, but one we stand behind. Given we have a very deep history in mental well-being and mental health and study of it and understanding of it, and we know that mental well-being is dependent on various factors, but most of all, it's that person's personal history and their own mindset. And how can you mandate or hold people accountable for their mental health well-being, or do it reliably at scale? And we've seen over and over again, this is failing now in organizations and starting to realize it just doesn't work. But what you can, and this is key, organizations are, however, responsible for their culture. So you're not responsible for people's well-being, but you are responsible for the culture. And organizations can create accountability around their culture. They cannot create accountability around mental well-being, which then gives us the imperative to look at a culture that itself generates well-being, because that's what I'm responsible for. I was having a conversation with one of the exec team members of this client I'm working with here in these 3 days, and I said to her, it's any person, particularly in most of the organizations we work with where there's a lot of knowledge workers, any person in that organization can afford an app, a mental well-being app. But that has some control that is completely independent of the company. They can help themselves. But most employees can do nothing about the organizational culture. That's something they just have to bear. And so that's where the leverage really lies in an organization, is looking at the culture. What does drive culture? So in our work, we look at typically what we call the 3 R's, 3 drivers of culture. And when we look at organizational rituals, so what are the embedded rituals, meetings, processes that support culture, and how can you modify and look at those? The other one we look at is the rewards and accountability system. So leveraging the rewards and accountability system to support a more aligned, healthy culture. And that does have a significant part to play. But the third R is the role modeling of leaders. So we've got rituals, rewards, and then lastly, the role modeling. The role modeling of the leadership is by far and above the biggest impact on a culture. We've done extensive research on this subject, as I mentioned earlier, and we present a leadership model that's got 7 practices. And again, we've done extensive evidence-based research that it has, what impact does this have on organizational outcomes like efficiency, innovation, engagement, mental health, and so forth. These 7 practices, I'll quickly cover them so you get a sense of them. The first one is that leaders are self-aware, they're present. The second is they take accountability, they hold people accountable. Surprise, surprise, accountability is a significant factor for well-being in the workplace, because when we don't hold people to account for behaviors that erode psychological safety or erode trust, we end up unwittingly eroding well-being in the organization. It's having a set of clear values, walk the talk. Leaders need to walk the talk. Fascinatingly enough, in our 22 years in this work, we would estimate that about 1% of leaders have clarity on the talk that they even trying to walk. There's a whole bunch of interesting adult development reasons for that, which we're not going to cover today. They have a clear vision. They are open-minded, cultivate beginner's mind. They experiment, take risks, create learning environments. They empower people. And lastly, they appreciate, recognize, and are empathetic and engage. The heart is the 7th practice. And then we've had this interesting look at, okay, well, if we measure leaders on classic, we know leadership behaviors that have an impact on performance, the organizational performance, but what impact does it have on the mental health of people in the organization? And our data tells us it has more or less 1/3 of a person's mental health, their individual mental health, can be explained by the way their boss is behaving, which is one of the reasons why we assert, if you want a well-being culture, to fail to look at your leadership behavior is truly insane. We couldn't even say it more strongly. It's just insane, because it's by far and away the biggest impact on people's mental health in the workplace. And it's something you can do something about as an organization. And not only is it good for mental health when leaders are leading well, it's also really good for business performance. So you can kind of have your cake and eat it. A little bit more detail on this is we looked at a specific question on what percentage of direct reports say that their workplace is a healthy workplace, a healthy place to work. If you look at the data is fascinating. This aligns with another huge body of research on leadership by Zenger and Folkman. And it tells us that the better leaders are around these kind of leadership practices we measure, the significantly more positive impact they have on, in this case, a healthy workplace. So what this is telling us is that 65% of people who reported that their boss is in the top 10 percentile, more or less, of great leadership are saying this is a healthy workplace, which gives you just how strong a correlation is to people's perception of a healthy workplace and their boss's behavior, their leader's behavior. And then if, again, you look at how quickly it drops down. So when you've got an average leader, only 18% of people report that it's a healthy workplace and so forth. And then the next question that's really interesting is, so what percentage of what specifically do leaders need to do in order to support mental well-being or a well-being culture? And we researched this. So again, this was about 5,000 people surveys and on about 450 leaders. And we correlated how people report their mental health as against specific statements on leadership. And we wanted to get what are the most important behaviors that leaders need to role model in order to have the most positive impact on people's mental well-being. And again, the mistake we see that many of our new clients make is this idea that you need to teach leaders on to have an "are you okay" conversation, for example. You need to teach them to empathize. You may teach them the 101 of mental well-being so that they can engage with their employees on that. But interestingly enough, it turns out that the basics of great leadership has a significant impact on people's well-being. So the first one, treats others with care and respect. That's a long-standing leadership question. Is a genuinely kind and friendly person. What we found is, I won't go into detail, I don't have time, is open-minded and curious. So they have a beginner's mind in leaders. They're clear, attentive, and focused. They're balanced, wise, and considered when dealing with difficult situations or crises. So what you'll start seeing as a theme here is that leaders have such a hugely positive impact on their team are leaders who self-regulate well, are connected and sensitive to their people. But that's not a mental health skill, that's good leadership. And then they are consistent. They have a talk that they walk that has a significant impact on trust and psychological safety. They make clear and understandable requests. Interestingly enough, we've been, as I said, I mentioned earlier, with an executive team at the moment, and nearly the entire 2 days has been focused on the lack of clarity around requests that happen in their organization, and then the subsequent frustration, confusion, despair. And so interestingly enough, this is a significant thing on people's mental well-being. And then lastly, takes a what can we learn approach to when holding others to account. Again, another body of work where we find that a lot of people think accountability is about holding people in account, warning them, etc. But actually turns out the biggest use of accountability is to create growth and learning for people. And when leaders do that well, it genuinely serves the mental well-being of people. Of course, all of these things also genuinely serve great leadership and high performance and psychological safety and all the other things we want. So we often say to our clients, like, if you're thinking, how can I spend the least to have the biggest impact on my organization on a range of factors? And we keep asserting that the research tells us over and over and over again, it sits in your leader's behavior. It also turns out that a company culture is primarily experienced through the lens of your boss, not through some broad anonymous. Your day-to-day experience of the culture happens in your team and your boss's behavior. You may have a quote unquote great culture, but your boss is not actually role modeling these kind of things. And then your own experience of the culture is going to be awful. All right, that's the conclusion. Before I move on, I just want to check, Julian, are there any questions I need to answer? Did you keep an eye on that?
No, all good. I'm on it and I'm answering anything. And if there's something for you, I'll let you know.
Okay, great. Thank you. So in summary, a well-being culture is something you can be something you're responsible for as an organization. You're not responsible for people's mental well-being, but knowing that your culture and the way, which is primarily determined by leaders and their behavior, given that you're responsible for it in an indirect way, you have a huge responsibility of your employees' mental well-being. And of course, we also know that people who well perform better and so forth, but it's this idea of locus control. Wisdom is trying to control what I can control and do something about what I can do something about. Ignorance is trying to control things I can't control. What can you control as an organization or do something about? Your culture and your leaders. The second element that some of you may or may not know is this term image management, which is making things a lot worse. So let's just help you understand what it is. And this is a quote from Robert Keegan from Harvard, and I'm going to read it to you. In an ordinary organization, most people are doing a second job no one is paying them for. Most people are spending time and energy covering up their weaknesses, managing other people's impressions of them, showing themselves to their best advantage, playing politics, hiding their inadequacies, hiding their uncertainties and hiding their limitations, right? So in two jobs, my real job and this whole other job, the politics, hiding, so forth job. I think most people instantly recognize this when we share this slide. And then I have a quick poll to give you guys a shared sense of reality, is what percentage of your time, again, this is anonymous, so please be as honest as you like or honest as you can, what percentage of time and energy is wasted on being in unnecessary meetings, politics, hiding weaknesses, conversations after the conversations, pretending support's not needed, not speaking up to overwork demands, etc., in your organization? In other words, and you've got some categories there, what percentage of energy, can be energy or time or both, is basically chewed up on image management, on these kinds of things in your organization?
The poll is running. We have a 130. I'm going to leave it for another 10 seconds and share the results with everyone. Right, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Up. And everyone should be able to see the results now.
Yeah. All right, so we've got less than 20%, we've got 22%, 21 to 30%, 36%, 31 to 50, 25, 51 to 70, 14, and above 73. So if my correct in understanding, you're about 58% in the 30% and below, and about 42% in the 31 and above. Okay, so hopefully you find that interesting. We've run this poll various times. We'll put this data in as well. What we discover is it tends to average out, this data tends to average out at around the 40% mark. But again, given the vast majority of people on the 21 to 30%, you can immediately get a sense of just a profound waste of time and energy that most organizations are facing with regards to image management. And the interesting thing about image management is that it actually turns out that all image management is based on a lack of psychological safety and a lack of integrity. So we found that these are absence of values. So people go, what do you mean a lack of integrity? So for example, conflict avoid, we often have clients who say, oh, I'm really good with integrity. And then maybe, you know, several minutes later, they'll acknowledge one of their leadership challenges is they avoid conflict. And so what we often highlight to them is, well, are you aware that conflict avoidance is an act of being out of integrity? You've got thoughts and then you're not actually aligned with what's, and so you're in avoidance, and that's an absence of integrity. And the vast majority of our clients are not aware or haven't connected the dots around most of their behaviors in relationship to values. And there's a whole host of interesting adult development, lack of self-awareness reasons for that. But we have found that one of the key solutions to image management is genuine values-based organizations. When you start seeing the contrast that values, image management is the absence. In the action, it's the absence of values. In the absence of values, you lose psychological safety, you lose alignment, and you end up in these image management-based cultures, which erode mental well-being, efficiency, and everything else.
So Michael, just a quick question from Nancy that I shared with you on the chat. We want to build a psychologically safe culture, a culture that employees feel empowered to speak up, push back, and challenge, a culture that celebrates failure but learns from their mistakes. What can we do as a people and culture partner to help leaders build this culture?
Okay, that's a big question. I mean, that would probably be a 2-hour webinar just on that. Let me try and give you a couple of quick highlights. One of the things we find is that a psychologically safe culture, the first thing we find in psychologically unsafe cultures is a lot of triangulation and gossiping. We also find incongruent behavior in leaders. So we also find a lack of honesty both ways. So you'll lose trust. And then primarily what we find is an absence of maturity in the senior leaders. So what we find is that leaders are themselves invested in image management. And if they ever get feedback, they defend their image. They don't actually understand the growth mindset process. Ironically, when leaders defend, and we all are prone to defending ourselves, when we defend ourselves, to a person, and I'll just invite you guys to consider as you're on this webinar, what's your experience when you try and give someone feedback and you get defense? They defend their behavior, they defend their viewpoint. How do you experience that or feel that? What happens very quickly is your sense of connection with that person's lost, that person's credibility is diminished in your eyes. And ironically, this is the tremendous irony of it, is that that person who's defending begins to feel better. There's interesting psychological reasons. So how do you create a psychologically safe culture? This is what our new book, Vertical Growth, is heavily centered on. Is it starts with role modeling of leadership. But how does that start? It starts with leaders who have a clarity of what the values they're trying to walk, so people can orient to trust. And they have a humility to take accountability for when they're not walking the talk. And in that humility to try and keep aligning to the values, people progressively feel more and more safe to actually call leaders out. And leaders feel more and more pleased that when they are called out, it gives them an opportunity to realign to values. And yes, there are organizations that exist like this and leaders that exist like this. The biggest thing we've seen in psychology, image management is both a symptom of a lack of psychological safety and a cause of a lack of psychological safety. When we become more interested in defending our image instead of values and growth, psychological safety in a speak-up culture becomes impossible. A second thing, no, I'm going to stop there. This is probably a conversation to take offline and just book a meeting with us, because it's a complex, there's organizational, it's just a complex. Hopefully I've given you a little bit, but it's a complex question. I want to just quickly talk about how image management can show up in a way that creates, interestingly enough, a psychologically unsafe culture in subtle and unwitting ways. And this is a story of one of our clients who, when I asked, I was on a conference webinar like this with 200 leaders, and sorry, Julian's just giving me a message, with 200 leaders, and they were, I asked them the question, so how do you believe leaders should be showing up in the current challenges? Because this is an organization with severe challenges. It was I don't want to give away the organization, but there were severe challenges in this organization, and all the leaders more or less unanimously agreed that you need to be brave, speak positively, be optimistic, share that things are going to be great with employees, and so forth and so forth. So they had this idea of the strong leader, which was not their truth. So when I asked them, can we just quit that story for a moment? Tell me how you're really feeling at the moment. We're feeling worried, we're feeling scared, we're feeling overwhelmed. And they started talking about the challenges they were feeling. We then asked them, so when you're on calls with your boss and other leaders, and you may be feeling scared, worried, overwhelmed, and struggling, and everyone else tells you they're great, it's, like, we're going to do this, how do you feel when you hear all that positivity around you? And the key thing they shared with us is they feel isolated and inadequate. And it's interesting because what's going on is that group of leaders are all collectively image managing. They're not telling the truth of what's really going on for them. They're putting up this brave face and image in what they think actually creates inspiration, confidence, and so forth, but it was actually creating the exact inverse. And this is the fascinating thing about emotional mismanagement, and how image management, even with the best intentions, creates isolation, disconnection, inadequacy, and ironically, a lack of psychological safety. Because if you're the one person saying, you know what, I don't feel so great, I am struggling, can someone help me? Then that's a kind of like a fly in the ointment. So just a quick illustration to show you how image management can unwittingly erode mental well-being while you think it's doing actual good. Let me carry on over. Julian's giving me a time reminder. Can you make a dent into image management? Oh, yes, you can. We've experimented with this. We created what's now a 12-week program, and we've assessed groups, and we found that you can reduce image management by 31%. How do you reduce image management and increase psychological safety? You do it through values alignment, accountability, and growth mindset, and then you create a well-being culture. Now, if you're sitting there, and hopefully I can add some more value to you here on the webinar, and you're thinking, okay, so I've got existing strategies, we've got things we're trying to do, but how can I make those? It may not be our strategies, but your existing strategies, how can I make them work even better? And here's 3 things to consider. First thing, don't run webinars. So webinars, like even this, ironically, this webinar is for the sole purpose of information. We do not think and hold the view that a webinar or a series of webinars can change anything meaningfully ever. It violates behavior science principles. And yet it's so appealing to keep running events and information to our organization in the vain hope that it will change. Change and genuine growth in an organization is more complex. It can be simple, but it's more complex. Webinars and events change nothing. What does change things? The first thing we need to help organizations with is what we call vertical growth. This is the title of our new book. And it's this idea that when people are invested in certain behaviors, they're actually, and I'm going to tell you the brief story of the very first case study we quote in our book. All our case studies are named. We have 26 in the new book. Sheila Frame from Amrit Pharma. Sheila was what she said was a firefighter who's constantly getting involved in micromanaging her team and firefighting her team. Her team said to her, look, you need to be more strategic, more accountable, and so forth. So she went on a skills training, which is this piece here, around how to help people plan more, be more strategic, more visionary, and plan. But what Sheila noticed is that she kept on going back to firefighting. So despite the skill set of, and this is the temptation a lot of organizations have, is that if I just give my leaders the skill set, I'll get the change, and then they're disappointed. And the reason why is because there's unconscious patterns in this example in Sheila that keep hijacking the skill set. That's what vertical growth is for. You have to give people the ability to see their patterns and regulate and overcome their patterns so that they can use the new skill set. What Sheila realized in one of our programs is that she had what she called an addiction to the firefighting because she was competent at it, good at it, and she felt like she was contributing at it. She was like almost a moth to a flame. So despite knowing the skill set she would do, she'd sort of find herself in the opposite behavior. And there's a whole bunch of interesting research. But we're just proposing to everybody who's listening to this, if you are having, like one of our recent clients told us, we've spent, their words, millions of dollars on feedback skills in our organization, millions of dollars. And we haven't seen an iota of change on feedback. We've still got an avoidant, nice culture. And the reason why is a lack of vertical growth. It's because the leaders are not understanding how to interrupt and deal with the fear and discomfort that comes up in the conflict. This unconscious deals, if you give me the skills, I'll never have to deal with the fear. It'll just all by magic. I'll just follow the skills. I don't have to deal with uncomfort. I won't have to look at my patterns, and it'll all happen. And it doesn't happen. And that's one of the failures. The other failure in this particular client and one of our clients is that it's event-based. It's not based in behavior science. Behavior science tells us that you need prompts, rituals, and support and accountability over time to create sustainable change. In fact, adult development tells us that you can only change one behavior in a 12 to 18 month period. And it could even be longer. One behavior. The mistake we often make when we want culture change or we want growth is we want to give people 5 or 6 behaviors in an event-based training, and then we put them back into the workplace. All the existing structures, reward systems, assumptions, and so forth are still in that workplace. And then we're shocked and surprised when it doesn't really move the dial on anything, and our gap between our values on the wall and our values on the floor don't change. And this, hopefully, if you look at this diagram, you can see this is why. It's because there's a lack of self-awareness and resilience within the people trying to change. They do need the skills, but then it needs to be embedded in a behavior science approach over time. And whatever you're doing, as you're listening to this webinar, we'd encourage you to ask yourself the question, do our processes and events and whatever we're doing in our organization, do they match and do they have these 3 elements? Do we have the vertical growth element? Do we have the skills? And do we have an embedded process over time to genuinely create the change in our organizations? Because that's the process, whatever the content you're putting in, that creates the goal, gets you to the goal reliably. And again, we also know this. I'm going to hand this over to Julian, because this piece of data echoes what we've just covered in the last slide.
Yeah, so basically what we've done a couple of years ago is when we, so after spending basically a couple of years really just promoting platforms and apps to clients to try and drive change and realize that it really didn't do anything, we came up with our own version of hybrid programs, which would basically be facilitated internally, ideally by the team leader. So to kind of merge both the team development and leadership development into one unique experience. And so we had 8 organizations, 218 employees all around the world that ran our first version of the program, which was called the Team Starter Program. And we partnered with the National University of Singapore to really measure the impact that it had on the 22 groups that ran the program. Again, it was done internally with no external support. They just ran it on their own. We gave them the kind of training in a package solution. And we measured the impact and we had really amazing results across all the board, across all groups. So we saw a decrease of emotional exhaustion up to 58%, but even the group that had the lowest amount of the lowest decrease was about 40%. Same with work engagement, flow, and so on. And that happened 2 years ago, and to this day, still it happened again less than a week ago. We have the leaders of the study that still, as they're changing teams, if they're moving organizations, moving divisions, and so on, they still get in touch so that they can run that very same program, that very same experience again with their team, just because it really helps create more genuine connection, which fosters belonging within the team and has all of the ramifications that Michael has been talking about in that presentation.
Thanks, Julian. Again, I just want to iterate to everybody that program embodies these three key elements, and the program itself is not, I wouldn't say it's super sophisticated. We do a lot of sophisticated stuff. This is one of our more basic programs. And interestingly enough, can have that amount of impact with a basic program. And again, as you're watching the system encouragement, you may have already amazing amount of content and embedded programs in your organization. If you can just get them reordered into this kind of structure and deliver in this way, you'll find an incredible improvement in the results you get if the goal is a well-being culture. So in summary, as we wrap up the webinar, we always advertise these an hour, but try and finish them in 45 minutes. Your company culture is within your locus of control. Employee mental well-being is not in your locus of control. Focus on what you can change and what you're in control of. Leadership behavior drives culture and has a substantial impact on mental well-being. Image management supports isolation and disconnection. We need to help leaders and people find more authentic ways to connect and take out the image, right, which creates a whole bunch of other good things. And then lastly, changing behavior requires vertical growth, horizontal skills, and behavior science-backed processes. Anything else wastes precious time and ironically decreases mental well-being. And now we have the standing jokes, right? It's like people are overloaded, they're working hard. What should we help them? Let's give them a mental health webinar, which of course only decreases their mental health. So as we wrap up, where are you on your journey around using solid principles to create an exact change? If you're wanting some support and help at no fee from Julian to work through your existing strategy, one of the things we've been really committed to, I know it sounds overly altruistic and I'll give you the shadow side of it, but we really do, we set out on this business to create less suffering, or to support the reduction of suffering in this world. That was a very original intention many, many years ago. And we are at peace. Yes, we're a commercial organization. We're genuinely at peace that if you call us and you have a session with us and we help you on your existing content and it helps you get a better result and helps the reduction of human suffering, great. So please feel free, even if you don't, oh, I don't want to buy anything or I don't want to use anything, but I'd just love to have an acid test on how am I going. Please scan it and book a session. We'd be delighted to help you and even just question some of your strategic things. And you'll also receive the bonus downloads. And with that, Julian, are there any?
Awesome. Yeah, just a couple of questions while people are scanning their QR code. So we had one, let me just get back to it. One from Lara, so that's related to when you were sharing how nice it would be to have leaders that, you know, show their vulnerability. To what extent should leaders show that they are struggling?
Yeah. So Lara, what our research tells us is that vulnerability is contingent on competence. So we found that when leaders share vulnerability, but they are perceived as incompetent, it actually doesn't generate any positive results. So that's the first rule of thumb. Leaders need to be competent. The second thing is that the struggle needs to be contextual. What we found, and these are the guidelines, and we even have a questionnaire that measures 7 stages of vulnerability. Because what we don't mean when we talk about struggling is we don't necessarily want them to use their group as therapy and so forth. But it's about emotional honesty. It's like, how am I doing? I'm feeling sad. So for example, today, with this executive team, we had a check-in, and I'm the presenter, and I'm, you know, there's certain perceptions, interestingly enough, that people carry of me. I'm this mindfulness expert, et cetera, et cetera. And some of them have these expectations that I should have my emotional ground perfect all the time. But I woke up, I read something last night on the bleaching of the barrier reef, like how bad the bleaching was this summer. And I woke up this morning in a profound state of grief. I was just constantly in tears this morning at the state of our planet. And so when we did a feelings check-in this morning with the team, I was able to share that where I am right now is I'm sort of barely holding it together because I'm in so much grief around the barrier reef and our state of our planet. And then we proceeded to carry on with the session, and we've had a very powerful session. It's the learning where leaders need to learn that your emotional world is not something to be hidden. It's just also not something that people have beliefs that it hijacks. It does not hijack. It's just a total lack of literacy around how emotional world works, and most leaders we work with. So when we say leaders are struggling, they can both acknowledge the struggle and acknowledge the positive things that they're doing and continue with work. Most people have this weird idea that if you're struggling, it's a sign of weakness and therefore you can't function. It's not true. So with that education, we found it's quite appropriate to speak the truth of what's happening in you contextually. So I'm struggling at the moment with work, or I'm struggling with something, and here's what I'm doing about it, and continue. When that happens, that level of emotional honesty happens, people feel they can bring their whole selves to work, and a whole range of good things happen in relation to connection and meaning. We're seeing over and over again people reporting that I feel disconnected from their organizations, isolated and inadequate, because maybe they're the only ones feeling the feelings they're feeling. And that's really what we're talking about. Again, it needs to sometimes be a little bit of education on this, because we've found some leaders kind of go for it and they end up using their teams as their own therapist, and that's not appropriate. I'm hoping that gives you some sense of the answer. A lot of it's to do with emotional education. Julian, were there any other?
The second question, so leaders who invest too much time on image management forget that they are not leaders without followers. So my question is, if leaders spend all their time on self-growth and image, how does this empower the followers? Where is the balance?
I'm not sure I fully understand the question, so let me try and attempt to answer what I think it's asking. Is that,
let me just repeat the second half, because that's really most the essence of it, I think. So if the leaders spend all their time on self-growth and image, how does this empower the followers? Where is the balance?
Great. So again, I'll have to answer in the context of our work. A leader's role is to serve their team. That's their number one role. That's absolutely explicit and implicit in our work. When a leader's working on their growth, the context of the growth has to be in service of the team. And let's give you a really easy example. And I'll even be able to give you an example of vertical skills versus vertical growth versus horizontal skills in this example. Let's say, in our processes, we always, when a leader's got to work on something, we always get the team to nominate it. So in the session we're running with an executive team this week, we're actually, we've done a 360 assessment on them. They help them deeply understand them. And right now, just as before I walked into the session, we're getting the team to make a direct request and a nominated practice for the CEO. So the CEO of this organization is now being told by their team, this is what you need to grow. This is the area you need to grow on to be a better leader. Now, interestingly enough, in this example, what they were asking this particular CEO to do is become a lot more proficient on clear agreements with people, because it's creating mass confusion. But it turns out, does this CEO know how to create clear agreements? Yes. But what's causing the lack of clarity is really interesting. This leader has conflict avoidance issues, right? Which is the vertical growth part. So what she's unconsciously, what she's starting to become aware of is that if she creates conscious agreements with people, it opens the door for real accountable conversations. So she's unconsciously invested in not being clear so that she can rescue people when they don't necessarily meet the unclear expectations, and then not necessarily have the confronting conversation, which then creates all kinds of side issues. So in the process of creating clear agreements, there also needs to be the willingness to face her fears around holding people accountable to those agreements. Her growth process, right? Her very growth process is stepping more and more into the clarity of the agreements. If the growth process is in service of the leader's brand, that doesn't make sense. But in terms of her values as a CEO, one of her values is integrity. What she's starting to, but integrity and empowerment is interesting. What she's starting to realize is that this avoidance habit is hijacking her ability to genuinely empower people. And she's out of integrity because a part of it is an avoidance, and she's just not aware of it. Vertical growth, part of the process of vertical growth, helping people become aware of what they're not aware of so they can do something about it. But hopefully that answers your question. It's like values alignment in a leader. When a leader really consciously understands the walk the talk values, is not image management. Invariably, it challenges image management. And the development practice they're working on should always be in service of their team to make them a more effective leader. Otherwise, what's the point of growth? The last point of growth is the reduction of suffering, psychological suffering, and the increasing of mental well-being. Very evident in our session this morning that the team is experiencing a dissonance and a frustration and a certain kind of suffering in the vagueness and the lack of clarity. So hopefully that gives you a clarity of answer. Like, it's not about, oh, I'm going to grow and I don't disconnect. That's just totally inappropriate.
Awesome. That's about it.
Okay.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for attending. Much appreciated. And wishing you a lovely day, and may you be well.